All right, what is up, my party people? It's Halsey with the Helicopter Podcasts, and I love doing the podcast. And one of my favorite things to do is catch up with old friends. And today is just that with my good buddy TJ Wesoloski. I said your last name right, TJ, right?
Close enough. It's Wesoloski, but nobody gets it right.
I don't know why. It's just like when I read it, it's like I can't even, for whatever reason, my little brain, excuse me, can't like put it together, even though I've known you for all these years. And so I thought it was pretty funny talking to Ian a couple weeks ago, and when we were talking about you coming on with Helicopter, I was like, I don't even know how to say his name, let alone spell it. And so Ian gave me the little trick of we solo ski. So
Yeah,
I
it's
appreciate
not
that.
pronounced that way though.
No, oh, man, I got something in my throat. Excuse me. Yeah, it's my last name I feel like is easier than yours, Scheider. But it gets skewed all the time. I get Schneider a lot, which is makes sense because that's more popular. But there's no N. But my favorite is Hazley Shitter. Is something I get a lot.
That's somebody not even remotely trying.
It's usually like the guy that's trying to sell you the auto warranty.
Yeah.
So kind of scam. And then my mom is she's Ginny with a G, and so she gets guinea shitter quite a bit. So I guess I've been called worse, but I guess I feel the pain because I can only imagine the last names people come up with for your name. So, but anyway, DJ, glad to have you on the show. I don't know what happened. I had a little smoothie when I started the podcast here. Now I'm struggling. It's gone down the wrong pipe, so I apologize to you and our listeners. Well, TJ, you and I met how many years ago?
I think so. I got to Hillsboro for flight school. You were assistant chief at the time, I think, and I started in January of 2013. So what's the math on that? 10 years, roughly?
Please don't ask me to do math, TJ. It's 10:30 in the morning here. I can't. Actually, that's pretty easy math. Yeah, 10 years. So
Yeah.
you, that's crazy. So you started 2013. I was doing the assistant chief thing. I feel like I have this recollection, and correct me if I'm wrong, but did you and I fly together? Was it for a stage check, or did we do something in Prineville at one point?
Yeah, so I went down. I'm trying to remember the exact flight, but I did my first solo down in Prineville, and then I did a bunch of other fun flights down there. That was kind of new for Hillsboro to go down there in the wintertime, and I was all about it. So yeah, I do. I think we did it was probably like a private stage check or something down there. I would assume just before my check ride. That sounds about right.
Yeah, that was one of those funny kind of Hillsboro things where I remember like sitting in my office, and I don't know if it was Chris Berg or Ryan McCartney or Marcus, one of the guys above me. It was like, "Hey, can you go like to Prineville?" And I'm like, "Yeah, what do you mean?" And they're like, "Yeah, like can you go to Prineville for like maybe a month, maybe three, maybe four?" I'm like, are you
Why?
asking? Are you telling me?" And it was kind of like a voluntold, So I remember like within, I think it was like 2 days, I was ferrying a helicopter over there with a student. And did you ever stay in like the little housing, the little?
Oh, for sure, man. Yeah, yeah. The little shack that was on the end of the runway there.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I don't know how it worked for the students. I'm guessing it's the same, but they had a helicopter instructor out there, which was me. And then they had a fixed wing instructor, and we actually had to share a room. So I'm like sharing like this small room on a twin bed, separate, of course. But it was like not actually. I enjoyed flying over there, flying over the Painted Hills and
Oh, I
Central
agree. Yeah, it
Oregon
was
and
awesome.
just epic training area. But honestly, like I look back at that experience and I kind of like cringe. I'm like, that was not fun. Just like being cooped up. But you're, I was a young uh, company man at the time, so I did what I had to, I suppose. But yeah, I do recall flying with you, and you. Something that kind of interests me about you is that I know that you kind of had a full almost life before helicopters. Someone like myself,
Sure.
I always kind of knew I was going to be in aviation, like ever since a little guy, and that's why I started. I think right out of high school, or even during high school. Did you always have a passion for aviation, or how did you know? Because I know that you were rafting and ski guide and all that stuff. Where did the whole aviation spark come?
I think I watched Top Gun too much as a kid, just like everybody else. Yeah, it's funny. I meet a lot of people in the industry that like were born and they knew that they wanted to be in aviation some way, shape, or form, and that was like so not on my radar at all. Like you said, it's almost like a full life before I discovered helicopter flight. Um, so yeah, I mean, digging into my past, I went to high school just outside of Chicago, and I really hated the Midwest and wanted to get out. And all
I
my
don't know
friends
why.
are, yeah, leaving and going to college, and like I didn't really have that track in mind at that time. I just graduated high school, and I'm like, man, I just don't want to go to school. So I did a bunch of odd jobs in the city, hated life. And then somebody recommended, hey, you can go live in a ski town and go to community college at the same time. And I was like, where's that at? And they said, Colorado Mountain College in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. And I was like, okay, well, let's go. Um, so I grew up, skiing and snowboarding. My parents taught me to ski when I was 3. So we'd always go out west, and I love the mountains. And I was like, this is a golden opportunity to get out of the Midwest and like figure out my life. So yeah, I moved to Steamboat. Lived in the dorms the first year. Did school, snowboarded every day, and was actually enjoying what was going on. And then our second year there, I shacked up with a bunch of dudes that were also going to school and just living the snowboard bum, lifestyle.
Nice.
And we were having a good time. And then one day, our roommate's like, "You know what? I'm going to leave and go fly helicopters." And I was like, "No, you're not. Sorry, it just doesn't work that way." And I was so, like I said, uninitiated on how it went. I was had in my head like, you got to go in the military and learn how to fly Blackhawks before you can fly civilian, all that stuff. Yeah, so my buddy Matt, he left and disappeared off of the face of the earth, and then like 2 years later came back, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I've got all my ratings. I'm flying tours in Alaska right now. Life is great. You should do it. It's a lot of fun." And I was like, "No way, dude. There's no way." So he kind of like instilled a little bit of like, hey, there is like a civilian side and anybody can do it, kind of a thing. And then what really kind of got me into it, I was hiking at Silverton Mountain, which is pretty gnarly terrain. And we're at like 13,000 feet on this knife edge hiking up, and hear a helicopter coming out of the valley below. Comes over the top of us, goes to the other side of the valley. The slider opens in the back, and I see a bag fall out of the helicopter, and then kaboom, like 15 seconds later, and they're dropping 14-pound satchel charges out for avalanche control
Oh my
on the other
god.
side of the valley. And
How cool.
I'm like, that is awesome. So there's another like, all right, so my friend Matt did it. That looks like a really cool job. Let's think about it. So I spent a couple years kind of like spinning the wheels, figuring out kind of really where my track was. I was in and out of college. And I'll never forget like day 2 of my senior year of college in Denver, just like sitting there listening to the professor drone on and on and on. And I literally got up at break, packed my stuff, went home. My girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, she was like, "Wow,
Nice.
you're home early." And I was like, "Hey, I think we should move to Oregon and I want to go fly helicopters." And she was like, "Okay." And so a little backstory, she's originally from Oregon, so kind of going home for her. And I'd already looked at Hillsboro as, kind of where I wanted to go. So yeah, that's it. Moved to Oregon. I'd never still been in a helicopter or seen one up close. I did a demo day at Hillsboro, did a quick 20-minute demo flight.
Sure.
And if you remember there, you got to pick up and hover backwards off of the ramp. I'd never flown backwards in my life. And I was like, as soon as we did that, here's a blank check. I'm ready to
Yeah.
go.
That's
And that
awesome.
got me hooked. Yeah.
That's one thing I love about the helicopter industry specific and even different than airplanes is there's kind of like a wild heart mentality. most individuals that are in helicopters we're a little bit different, and I think that I can imagine myself being in your shoes, that restless soul sitting in the back, hearing some professor talk about the quadratic formula and not knowing why the f I'm there,
Yeah.
and kind of daydreaming, and that's what I think the cool thing about helicopters is because it allows people like you and I that need a little more in life, an opportunity to do something that's really cool, do something that's really fun, and something that you can long term, make a living and support your family. And so it's always I just find that it's so different than fixed wing aviation. Not to say that there's not those restless souls, that are flying in fixed wing aviation, but I find that helicopters really attract that kind of specific person. Um,
Yeah, for sure.
and I like those people. It's like I feel like a lot of my helicopter friends, I also have very other similar hobbies with. Like for you, skiing, mountain biking, river rafting. It seems like it's just kind of like this mindset or this mentality of, we like to have fun. And at the end of the day, we all fly helicopters because it is fun. It gets a little less fun sometimes, right? It becomes more of a job at some points. But overall, anytime you get into a helicopter, you flip a switch. If you don't feel something, you're crazy because to me, it's like the most incredible feeling. That's insane to me, though, that did you like physically move to Oregon before you even took a flight?
Yeah, we packed up and that was it, man. And there was like some other circumstances in the background. Our dog at the time, Eddie, was a pit bull, and there was a pit bull ban in Denver. And we lived just outside of town, so it was hard to we're looking for housing. Our lease was coming due. There was a lot of other circumstances that kind of prompted us to move, but literally, I walked out of class, went home, and said, "Let's go west."
That's so funny. Now it's
Yeah.
just funny how kind of all I always look back at life and it's like I look at these different events that maybe seem small or sometimes even big when they're happening, and then you look back and you're like, man, that event that triggered something that's turned into something amazing. Like a pit bull ban in Denver is a trigger to push you to go west to go and fly helicopters. Obviously that's like a big deal, not being able to have a house in Denver or whatnot. But it's like it's just crazy that leads to now what you do for a living. Which is
Yeah, it's
just
all the
crazy.
little details adding up. Yeah, so like I said, there was a small smolder in the background, but then yeah, kind of at that point in my life, there was a couple of big things that just kicked a fire under my butt and made me want to go do it. So
So with your buddy Matt learning how to fly, kind of sparking it, and then seeing the helicopter doing the avalanche control. When did you actually like start searching? I mean, were you how did you find Hillsboro? How did you pick Hillsboro? Obviously your wife is from Oregon, so that's a nice plus. But I mean, like when did the research happen compared to like you stepping foot on campus?
yeah, so I would say there was probably about a 2 year period there where I was trying to finish my bachelor's degree in something. I wasn't sure what, but we were told get a bachelor's degree and then you'll get a
Basket
job.
weaving.
Yeah, exactly. So it was always in the back of my mind. I'd get done rafting for the day and be super tired and sunburnt and tired from yelling at people all day, and then be like, "There's got to be something more." Um, so yeah, there's probably about 2 years or so. I talked to my buddy Matt, who was in the industry already. I was like, "Hey, I'm really thinking about this seriously. What do you recommend for flight school?" And he gave three, and Hillsboro was in that three. And again, with the whole Oregon connection and them having a really good reputation in the industry, it kind of made sense. It was a lot cheaper than moving to Hawaii at the time. So
Yeah, I mean Hawaii would be pretty epic, but I think Oregon, and I could be biased, right? I'm a Hillsboro guy too, and grew up, 25 minutes from Hillsboro, so I'm biased for sure. But I think Hillsboro has training figured out, and they have it figured out now, and they have it figured out back then when you and I were going to school. But other than that, they have like to this day, I don't believe there is a better place to train than the Pacific Northwest.
no way,
Um,
man. I mean, in Hawaii, again, yeah, it'd be fun, but What do you do on your long cross country? Go
Yeah.
clockwise instead of counterclockwise
Yeah,
typically? Like,
exactly. Like you have the
um,
cross country potential, you have different options, you have airspace near, not nothing major, but we had a Charlie somewhat near, so that was good for students. And for me, the most epic part of training, specifically in Oregon, was the off airports,
oh yeah.
and even more specifically Hillsboro, that West practice area, going into that coastal range. In fact, I was in Tillamook. Look, I got my Tillamook Cheese Factory coffee
There you
mug.
go.
I'm not sponsored by Tillamook, but if you would like to sponsor me, you can. I'll take free cheese as compensation. But I was there just a couple weeks ago. I've been there for years, and driving through the mountains there, coming out to the coast and looking off to the right and seeing the hills brought back all these memories of like, oh my gosh, like this was my playground for 6 or 7 years. So, I'm definitely biased, but even like compared to Central Oregon, I just feel like the Willamette Valley has such great training areas, great off airport opportunities. And so, when it came to your training, um, obviously, I think if you came in 2013, I left, I think April of 2014. So obviously we had some overlap. We had some flying together as we talked about. Uh, how long from kind of start to finish did you take to complete your training? What was awesome about training and what was difficult? What were some areas in which you struggled or didn't enjoy like maybe you thought you would?
Yeah. So let's see, started in, yeah, January of 13, and I did my CFII check ride June of 14. So I was basically 7 days a week, 24/7, and got through in about a year and a half. And the reason I was able to do that, I think, is because I just dedicated everything to it. I, had my girlfriend at the time, but I didn't have kids. I didn't have a job. I didn't have anything. I was just living, breathing, eating helicopters. And I had a great instructor, Mike T, who I'm still good friends with, that I still talk with.
Mike
And
T.
yeah, shout out. Him and I, as you know, very similar personalities, and we got along right away. And we both were privately funded, both did the Colorado thing. We had a ton in common. And we both had the goal of like saving as much money as possible and getting through as quickly as possible. So I basically told him, I was like, if you ever have a student no show you, like, give me a call.
That's
And there
awesome.
were so many times where, somebody would stand him up and he'd be on the flight line with a helicopter and no student to fly. He'd call me. He'd be like, I'll have it pre-flighted and you get your butt here and let's go do an hour of whatever. And so that was super beneficial to have that relationship and be able to get it done. Um, Man, as far as like some of the hardships, I think is keeping your ego in check. Like, I think that's a big one in this industry. And I'll never forget, like, you start getting through passing stage checks, you get your check ride under your belt, and you're like, all right, I'm invincible. I'm actually pretty good at this. And that's, a hazardous attitude. You got to be careful with that. And I did fail my commercial check ride the first time. And that was a good, like, gut check. Like, hey, you're not the king here. And it really took me down a notch, reset the kind of the mindset, and then I've had that ever since, which was good.
Who is that check ride with?
Carl Cotton.
Oh, Carl. So I never had a check ride with Carl. He's still doing them. I hear his name out here in Central Oregon quite a bit. I did all my check rides with Mark Holstat or Sean Moretz. I got pretty lucky. Hey, podcast listeners. My name is Halsey Schreider, and I'm the principal broker and owner of Celicopter. Celicopter is a new age, data-driven, helicopter-specific sales brokerage, bringing helicopter listings to new heights. At Celicopter, we utilize digital positioning, paid advertising, and our large network of industry professionals to move your helicopter quickly and efficiently. Unsure the value of your helicopter? Lucky for you, Celicopter offers a complimentary market evaluation. All you have to do is contact the team today. Are you ready to take your helicopter listing from Mayday to payday? Easy. Fill out the contact information below, and a Celicopter pilot agent will reach out shortly. Celicopter. List it, sell it, done. So yeah, I think with you start to get the certificates, you start to kind of think you're awesome. And I remember actually, I think it was when I got my CFI. There's a kind of a higher time, 1 foot out the door CFI that was always he was an intense dude, but he always had some like decent tidbits of wisdom. And I was at dinner with him because, ironically enough, his aunt was my high school German teacher. And so we were all together at the Olive Garden, and I think he could kind of tell like I had this maybe this swagger that was inflated from really what I was at, and I think he said something along the lines of like, "Hey, that CFI doesn't really mean anything. What it means is now it's your ticket to learn and get better and not kill yourself or your student." And I took that to heart, and I heard him when he said it, but it wasn't until I got actual experience under my belt of teaching people um, that I started to realize exactly what he meant. And when I was doing stage checks myself, specifically the CFI stage checks, I made them really hard because like I wanted people to kind of get that ego check to realize like, hey, yeah, you're getting your CFI, but your 200 hours doesn't mean much. And if anything, it's really just a recipe for disaster if you bring the wrong mental state. So it's interesting that you said that, and it probably sucked at the time to bust a check ride, but it sounds like maybe long term it was kind of something that was maybe necessary.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you a better person for sure. It's a learning experience.
So you get through your training real fast. You treat it like a job. I forgot that you were with Mike T. That's very lucky. Love Mike T. Who doesn't
Yeah,
love Mike T? Is there anyone that doesn't like Mike T?
they're not
Um,
human if they don't.
he's just like he's just one of those guys. Like I could see people not liking me. I'm sure it happens, and I know it does actually. But Mike T, like he's the guy. Like he's like just the nicest dude. So shout out to Mike T. Maybe I could get him on the podcast sometime.
Yeah,
Um, I haven't seen him since Vegas days. So you get through your training. Did you work at Hillsboro? I don't even know.
I did. Yeah, so I finished up, and then there was no work. Nobody was leaving. They were full. They were not hiring instructors, and so I just took out this huge loan. Got through. Telling my financial backers basically like, yes, I'm going to be successful in this. And then I sat for oof, 2.5, 3 months before I even had an interview. Like I was calling the school and I'm like, hey, like, should I stick around or should I go look elsewhere? I really want to work here, but I mean, I just got to start now or I got to figure something else out. No, no, we promise we'll give you an interview. We'll give you an interview. And yeah, so I finally got an interview. And if you talk to Dan Docker, was one of the guys in the room. I think it was still one of his most memorable job interviews that he conducted at Hillsboro.
Uh oh.
No, I think I just put on a good show, let my persona shine, and they loved it and offered me a job there. And then no students. So now I'm hired, but no students. So I spent my first month and a half at Hillsboro in the attic of the hangar in the archives, um, sorting and filing all previous student flight records by myself, sweating it out up there. Anything to do work and just to like stick around and like
So you could get the $10 an hour admin pay.
you got it. And to prove
Hey,
that I really wanted to be there.
yeah, you gotta do it. That was always hard for me. We Marcus and I at that time. Marcus was the chief. I was assistant chief. We were in charge of all the hiring, and we did pretty good at like not over hiring, or kind of knowing like, hey, this is what we need. This is who we're losing. But there was a couple of times. I remember one specific time where we hired a great candidate. Um, and we just didn't have any students for him. And I was trying to, offer him the admin work and, demo flights and whatever. And unfortunately, he kind of was like, "Man, it's not working. I'm going to go to this flight school." So we lost a good CFI. So good on you for sticking it out. Obviously, that changed. Kind of tell me about your time as an instructor there, and what that was like for you.
Sure. Yeah. So just continuing that same, storyline there. They had a group of students come, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm going to finally get a student." My first student I got was from China, but he was self-funded. He wasn't part of one of the programs. So his English was so. So I did like probably 2 weeks of ground school with him. And then I was like, all right, do you understand anything I'm telling you? And he's like, no. So we had to back it up. I was basically doing uh, English lessons as well as helicopter lessons with him. And that was my very first student. And I'm very proud to say that he actually completed his private check ride successfully and then went back to China. That was his goal. And he did it in a pretty normal amount of time. I think it only took about 5 months for him, which is pretty remarkable considering he barely spoke English when he showed up.
Yeah, I mean, kudos to you. I don't know how. I know that they ended up doing some China programs for the helicopter side. Obviously, the fixed wing side there at Hillsboro was like all, Asian students. And I, I never was part of those programs, even when they came to the helicopter side. And for me, I can't even fathom how you do it. Like, how do you teach someone to fly a helicopter that literally does not speak proficient English. And not only that, I mean, the language that they're used to is not even close to English. I
Right.
mean, that's incredible and kind of hard that that's your first student.
Yeah, trial by fire, right? So then I got one other student there. So I was like working very part time at best. And then, excuse me. Um, so I got hired on in like October ish or end of September, early October that year. And then all the senior CFIs were putting in for their, Christmas vacations and wanted to take time off. And so if you remember back in the day, like you had to have your students covered before you could get PTO signed off.
Hmm.
So I started agreeing to cover everybody's students without really thinking about it too much. So it's pretty funny. I'll never forget. I went from having two students to having like 30 students that I
Oh
covered for
gosh.
basically a month and a half.
Wow.
So my workload went from basically nothing to like, oh my God, what have I done to myself? And I
Yeah.
somehow I somehow managed to get through that with no real complaints as far as I know, and got a lot of really good flights in, got some students progression and all that. And then yeah, just sort of you gain um, experience as an instructor and you get more and more workload. I think one of the best things that I did while I was there is I always volunteered to do group ground with the VA classes. The what was it? The CC, whatever the community
PCC.
college. Yeah, PCC. Thank you. So they would bring 8, 10 students on at a time, and I would do all of their group grounds with them, and then usually I'd get one or two of those guys to fly with primarily as well.
Nice.
So that kept me busy. And then yeah, I guess I was had the right attitude, and Dan and the senior people at the flight school liked me, so I got checked out to do full down stuck pedal, the mountain flying stuff, so all the advanced sort of fun flying that we got to do. And I spent pretty much my second half at Hillsboro, the second portion of my career there, only doing full downs and stuck pedal and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's
So it was
awesome.
a good experience. Yeah.
And I think it's cool too. I mean, whether you fully were making the intentional decision or not, I always like to hear when people take advantage of an opportunity. These guys are leaving for Christmas. You desperately need work, and you did what you had to do. And so I always encourage people. A lot of our listeners are kind of students, going through school, maybe just starting as a CFI. It's always a good reminder that you have to sometimes be creative. You sometimes need to do the admin work. You got to stick it out. Um, and you have to take advantage of opportunities when they come. It's kind of like sports, right? Like if you're a second string guy and the first string guy gets hurt, you know, go out there and outshine that person. Don't give him
Right.
that starting spot back. It's kind of similar to that. So, and that's cool. I didn't realize that you were doing the CFI training, and I can echo that experience because that was really, I lived in Oregon. I was part of the management team at Hillsboro, which, I've talked a lot about on the podcast before, whether that was really great or not great or somewhere kind of in between. But I enjoyed it because I was in Oregon, and I was with family. I had a good living situation. Um, so, I mean, I was there for a long time, and a lot of my flying experiences teaching was doing, stuck pedal, full downs, doing kind of more of the fun flying, so to speak. And, I look back at that time and I kind of like, I don't know if I look back with fond memories, but also like some like, oh my God, that's terrifying. Like I was 23 years
I
old and doing all these full downs, like a whole, I'm so glad that I'm here.
I can't believe I made it through my entire time as an instructor. And maybe I should put this as the header on my resume. 1,200 hours dual given, zero overspeeds, zero bent metal. I don't know how
Nice.
it happened, but I was lucky. And again, looking back at those times, like, yeah, there's a lot of good memories. Would I do it again? Maybe in an A star.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I never had an overspeed. I can tell you, just as you probably were, I got really good at like the rotor stop overspeed. The front
The
jab,
sniff,
the right
the
jab,
yeah, the punch.
and I got really good at protecting the throttle. For engine. But I did the one thing that I had, and this is there's a lesson somewhere in this story. I was doing 141 checkout. So every year, as a 141 program, for our listeners who may be unaware, the instructors have to go and do a checkout. I think it's an annual. You go fly with an approved checkout pilot, and I was one of those approved guys. And I was doing that checkout with a guy named Cern Sauer. Do you know Cern?
Oh yeah.
And Cern was also one of the few CFI instructors. So he's a guy that's doing full downs all the time. What's worse than having two
Yep.
slight egos that both are pretty good at doing full downs in the cockpit? I mean, that's just a recipe for a potential disaster. And it was the perfect day, TJ. We had like 10 knots headwind, and we were just greasing full downs. I mean, they were like just grease, 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 grease. And we weren't saying like who can do better, but we were trying to see who could do better. And on one of mine towards the end, hold it, it's great. And then just like this little, and I tapped the stinger, which in my defense, in most helicopters, the stinger is part of the landing gear. They tell you to use it,
Yeah.
specifically on Bell aircraft and um,
EC
but
130 for sure.
EC 130. So you would have thought like I had crashed the helicopter the way it was kind of treated from that. I mean, it was like the smallest little nick. So I don't have a perfectly clean record as you do. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And if
Don't
you're
mean to
listening,
brag.
I mean, it's impressive. Honestly, like um, it is easy to overspeed a helicopter, especially as a new CFI teaching auto rotations. Um, Students do weird things. Your best students do the weirdest things. My best students during CFI training would lower the collective and roll on. You know, and you're ready for it. By that time, it's like, okay, yeah, this is Tuesday. I'm good to go. It's
Yeah.
like it's your job, and you get really proficient. But to get through, not bend any metal, not have overspeeds, it's impressive. I look back and I'm surprised that I didn't like bend metal. Like you're teaching full down auto rotations every single day, auto after auto after auto. I feel like the odds are kind of against you. Like you're going to have a bad one.
100%.
And if I recall, and I have to go way back in the memory bank because it's been a long time, but I got pretty good at being like, oh shit. Oop, I'm not supposed to swear on my podcast. Sorry. Um, darn it. I got pretty good at being like, oh no, like this is maybe going to be a harder landing. And I would just put it right on the toes, so you can kind of, absorb some of that energy. And the fold down ships towards the end of their life started to have a little bit of a sag,
Yeah, for sure.
inherently. But no, that's cool that you did that. So you, in my opinion, that's the best possible CFI route. Work at the school that you trained at, go up, do your private students, do your commercial students, but then be able to show that you're the right guy to get into the more advanced stuff. Because actually, if you look at it, especially like a school like Hillsboro, there could be 40 CFIs, and two of them, likely one of them being the chief or the assistant chief, are doing full down training. It's very limited number. So I think that for you to have that experience, that's something that not a lot of people got. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I feel lucky for it for sure.
Um, Mike T, he's a Papillon guy. Is that what spurred your next move?
Yeah, so when I got into this, the natural progression was like flight school, CFI, go do tours somewhere, and then go get the real job, right? Quote unquote. And so yeah, through networking, Mike T was lead pilot at Papillon by the time I finished my time at Hillsboro. So I actually went down to visit him, go shake hands with the chief pilot, introduce myself. Hey, I didn't quite have my 1,000 hours at the time when I was there, but I'm like, hey, just give me a couple months and I'll be ready to go. And, they see people like that every day down there. So he's like, yeah, whatever, kid, call me when you're ready. But I thought it was important to make that, interaction and that meet and greet in person. And so, yeah, I got my hours and submitted my resume. Unfortunately, I missed the hiring window. The tour operators down in the canyon usually hire like January, February, March to fill their summer slots to replace the guys that they lost over the last year. And so I got my 1,000 hours. It was like April of that year, and I was like,
Okay.
"Oh man, like there's no way I can do another summer of instruction." I was starting to get burnt out at that time.
Yeah.
Um, and so I was kind of bummed there. And then for whatever reason, Papillon had an emergency need for a new training class. So they called us in July, actually June, excuse me, of that year. Went down, did an interview. They ended up hiring 6 of us for this like midsummer class. And yeah, got on. So again, trial by fire. You're flying tours in the canyon. It's 117 degrees out. You're at max gross minus an ounce because that's how tour helicopters make money.
Yep.
And the EC-130B4 is a very capable aircraft, but in the middle of the summer, they're not the most powerful. So I learned how to fly turbine aircraft in like rugged conditions.
Yeah.
I remember picking up off the ramp, and you'd be full right pedal with warnings going off, and you're
Dong, dong.
backing into a 35 knot tailwind, which I'd never flown in. And it's just like, here you go, like welcome to the big world.
Yeah, it's funny that were you in Boulder City or were you South Rim?
Yeah, we're Boulder City.
It's funny that you say that because I don't think we've really talked about it much. A lot of the guys on the podcast, similar path, right? Flight school, tours, including myself. I took a little detour in between flight school and tours, but eventually ended up at tours as well. And yeah, it's like an intro level position, right? 1,000 hour, you know what you're doing. You can fly a helicopter, but it's actually fairly intense, especially in the beginning. To me, there's a pretty big learning curve because it's usually your first exposure to being in a 135 operation environment. So that in itself, just like you have to wrap your head around that. Like, okay, op specs, GOM, what am I allowed to do? What's going to get me fired? So you have to kind of not just know the FAA rules, but you need to know like your internal policies. And then you're getting into this aircraft that's extremely different than a Robinson aircraft. Big mushy pedals and a giant vertical fin. And you're exactly right. You pick that thing up with a tailwind, which happens a lot in Boulder City and Vegas. You're over limiting just because of your power pedal. Not to mention that did Papillon have like the STC for the extra seat too? I mean, so were you really packing them?
Yeah, luckily I was a big enough boy that I usually, unless it was like a 12-year-old, I usually flew with a 6-pack. But still, I mean, the seat's right there. It's encumbering your movement.
Yeah. So, I mean, I did not have that luxury. I always had someone in that seat. And, if you think about it, man, 7 people, 7 lives in your hand flying a helicopter. It's a lot of responsibility. And so I think people kind of look at it as like, oh, it's an entry level job. It's not a big deal, but it's a steep learning curve. It
100%.
took me a while to feel comfortable, and the winds do weird things down in the canyon. you just there's different variables that definitely make it more of a challenging job than not. And then at some point it becomes fairly routine and you get
Yeah.
used to it. You get used to the aircraft. That's probably when you can get hurt, right? It's when things start to feel real normal, and you kind of let your guard down. But
Quick story on that. I mean, I remember this is kind of like the running theme of this podcast, but I remember leaving flight school. And like you said, I was, one of the few instructors that was doing full down. So the ego started to creep back up, right? And then I got to Papillon and, looking at the other guys in the training class. And it's like, all right, yeah, like, who's the best pilot? You know?
yeah, I
Uh,
stack up. I stack
yeah,
up good.
exactly. And then I remember my first day on the line, or like first week on the line, I was like, swimming with sharks. I had no clue what I was doing. Like you said, you could fly the helicopter, but there's so much other stuff that goes with it. I definitely felt overwhelmed for the first couple of weeks that I was there. And then you slowly get into the routine, and then, it becomes fairly simplistic, as far as jobs are concerned. So again, it's like another one of those like ego check career moves, where you go from the top to now you're a newbie that doesn't know anything. Um,
It's
yeah, it was
common
kind of,
too. It's common in the aviation helicopter world for a while, right? Because yeah, you become top dog at flight school, and then you start your next job, most likely tours, and then you're a little guy again. And then by the time you leave tours, you're top dog at tours because everyone else above you has already left. And
yep.
then you start air medical or whatever you're doing, and you're the low guy again.
Yeah.
Um, it's kind of like that constant. You're awesome, and then you're not so awesome. You're awesome. No, you're not so awesome.
Yeah.
And then
It's kind of,
sometimes the helicopter will remind you, right? You'll scare yourself a little bit, and you're like, "Oh God, I am not that cool. I need to cool my jets a little bit."
yep.
What do you remember seeing me in the Las Vegas airport?
When was that?
I think you had maybe just got hired with Papillon. What years were you at Papillon?
Oh God. Um, Started my current job at 18. So 18, 17. I started, I think June of 16.
Okay, yeah. So I think I might have been at Map. I should have been at Map. Yeah, uh, January or February of 2016 is when I started flying tours, and I was at the airport for whatever reason. I was going somewhere, and I looking down and I see this guy wearing a little monkey suit with the the epaulettes and everything.
Oh yeah. I was jumping home probably.
Yeah, and I think you were coming home, and we chatted for a sec. But anyway, I wasn't sure if you remember that or not.
No,
I
sorry.
guess I'm very unmemorable. It's kind of sad. How long did you fly at Papillon?
I was there almost 2 years. I was kind of to the point where it was like, do I want to stick around, be the lead pilot, maybe move into management, or go do something else? And honestly, like, because I have a tour background, whitewater rafting and all that stuff, like, I actually didn't mind that job. It was pretty cool. The one thing I did not like is the desert heat. And so that was my big motivator to get out of there. If that job was like, I don't know, in Colorado or Oregon or someplace more temperate, I'd probably still be there. But yeah, I didn't like the desert heat anyway. And so it was time to move on. So EMS was kind of the next logical step for me.
Yeah, the heat is difficult for sure. I I also had a hard time dealing with people. Yeah, I got a short patience sometimes, and I was. It seems like it was starting. I don't know if it was just maybe a poor attitude that I had, but towards the end, it seemed like man, every group of passengers was either throwing up on me or complaining about something because it was too hot. And it's like, well, you booked the tour in August in the Mojave
Yeah.
Desert, like
At 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
please don't yell at me for this for your mistake. So that kind of got old, but yeah, I guess you have more of kind of a service background, so I guess you had a better backbone for it. Transitioning into air medical, was it directly from Papillon to Life Flight of Maine, or was there something in between?
Yeah, straight to Life Flight of Maine. So the beauty of working in the tour environment is, Papillon had at the time, let's call it 50 pilots that were working 7 days a week there. We had our days off, but everybody's rotating through. So that's 50 guys to network with that know other jobs or other places in the industry. So a guy that I flew tours with here, he's originally from Boston. He moved back to Maine when he was finished flying tours and got hired with Life Flight of Maine, and loved it. And so I kind of stayed in touch with him. I was starting to get burnt out, again, thinking about my career, whether I wanted to stay there or not. And I was like, hey, how's EMS in Maine? And he's like, it's good, it's challenging, and the Augusta 109 is a lot of fun to fly. And quick side note, I always thought that was the sexiest helicopter when I was in flight school.
I agree.
People lust over like the Sky Crane or like the other heavy metal, but I was like, no, give me the Ferrari. I mean, it's a sweet looking ship.
No, they look amazing. It's being in sales, a lot of my private clients that want to look really cool and have a helicopter, they gravitate towards the 109. I have to usually talk them out of it for other reasons, and explain why they're, a twin engine helicopter is $600,000, but we don't need to go there on this podcast.
Right. But yeah, so anyway, they were hiring at the time, and I used my networking with Taylor, and he got me an interview with the chief pilot. I flew to Maine. I'd never been to Maine in my entire life. Did the interview, got hired on the spot, and then went back to Vegas, packed up all my stuff, and drove across the country.
It's like the typical story, and with the wife too, right? So she's had to follow you along, or how'd that all work?
Carrie had finished nursing school in Oregon, and then moved to Vegas, obviously with me. And then we got married while we were there, and she had signed a contract with the hospital that she was working at.
Okay.
And like, she probably could have left if she wanted to, no big deal, but she's a better person than I, so she wanted to finish that contract, I guess.
That's cool.
So yeah, I moved to Maine in October, rented a house on the beach. It was pretty nice. Got a really good deal on it. And Carrie stayed for another 4 months and then moved out with me. And the rest is history.
The rest is history. Now, something before we kind of wrap it up, it's an IFR program, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, I enjoyed. Was Ian there before or after you?
Ian was hired like 6 months before I was. Yeah.
Okay, so you guys, that's how you all met. He was already on the line there.
Yep.
Sorry that you had to meet Ian. Ian tells me a story, or has told me a story, and he might have even talked about it on his podcast, but we've talked about it personally too, of just like that first experience of actually going IMC. And kind of what that experience was to him. I'm curious from your perspective, flying VFR for your entire helicopter career, then to be given the keys to a, single pilot IFR 109. What was that first experience like? And what is it like now today where you're doing it, more often, more experienced?
In a word, terrifying. I haven't heard what Ian said, so this is completely my perspective. Yeah, the thought of it, I was like, it's definitely the next progression in the career. It's something that I haven't done, so let's go do it. I remember being very, very nervous the first time we punched in. When you're in flight school, especially, they were like, don't touch the clouds. If you go in the clouds, you're dead. You're
dead.
You've heard that your whole career up until this point.
And there's a lot of truth to it, really.
Yep. So there we are, climbing at 85 knots, and you can see the ceiling getting closer and closer and closer to you. And you're like, yeah. And then, you punch in, and you have every sensory overload that they talk about in the FAA, all the spatial disorientation, all that stuff. And like, my head went swimming. And then I like took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and then went to work.
Nice.
Yeah, it was totally fine after that. And I also had, a safety pilot riding next to me doing this training. I wasn't just by myself doing this.
Okay.
And so, that was my first experience. It was super terrifying. And then once you're in it, you're like, oh, all right. If you just don't look outside and do everything like you've been trained, focus on your instruments and keep yourself busy, it's fine. And now
it's like not a deal.
Yeah, now it's still, sometimes we have really long legs in Maine. Sometimes we'll fly an hour 20, hour 30, sometimes 2 hours with a fuel stop just to get to a patient.
Wow.
But if you're doing that IFR, it gets a little claustrophobic. You can't see the nose of the aircraft for an hour and 15 minutes. I start to like, oh, let's do a checklist, or like, let's pull out the quick reference handbook and read about an EP right now or something, just to keep your mind off of like the claustrophobia being in the clouds. And then like my favorite days for IFR is like you climb up through, a 3,000 foot thick layer, you get on top of it, and you're just surfing the clouds, just
Yeah.
like in and out, in and out, in and out of the tops. And then you do a nice descent. You pop out 500 feet above the ground, and there's a runway or a helipad in front of you.
Yeah.
And
It's
you're
like,
like,
it's like,
the
that's like
system
fun.
works. Yeah, that's super fun.
Yeah.
So
Oh, I'm sorry.
I prefer, that's type of IFR flying versus can't see the nose of the aircraft. But we do it. I mean, it's the nature of the job that we do now.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. I mean, it's an experience I don't have, and probably will never have. At this point, my career path is a little bit different, and not necessarily progressing in the flying sense. So maybe someday if I make enough money, I can buy an IFR equipped helicopter and
There you
and
go.
fly some IFR. But who knows? I don't know if that will happen. But I think it's neat because it's to me, it's kind of the pinnacle of that route of flying.
Yeah.
I think there's a pinnacle of utility flying, like you're flying a sky crane or a Black Hawk or whatever. You're doing cool external load operations, or you're doing, short haul with, humans on the other end. I think that's kind of that pinnacle on that side. But I think for the path that you and I have chosen, uh, what I consider to be white collar flying is, flying instrument. And so I think it's really cool. I am jealous, kind of. I'm also kind of like, I don't know if I need it or not. But there's always like this side of me that's like, man, that would be a neat experience. And I feel like I would be, I'm like a systems guy. Like I think I could do it, but I haven't had that opportunity. So, that's
You
lucky
start
that
to crave
you
it.
have that.
I mean, I was pretty nervous, tiptoeing my way into it at first, but now it's something that I'm like, man, I wish there were some clouds today so I could go fly IFR.
Well, it's probably one of those things too. Like you want to do it enough to feel comfortable. It would be kind of crappy if it's like you're not doing it enough to where every time feels like the first time.
Yeah. That's how the first flight in the spring is usually that. We have like zero IFR flying in the wintertime out here just due to icing. And so we go a long stretch, 4, 5, 6 months maybe where we haven't done an IFR flight. We'll do our check ride, everybody get current, for the 6 months. And then it's up to us to, use it
Get in the
basically.
clouds.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, TJ, we're wrapping up on time, man. I really appreciate you coming on. It's been so fun to reconnect. You've also recently joined the Celicopter team, which I'm super excited about, and just excited to continue to get to know you. And it was fun to take a little trip down memory lane of our combined Hillsboro days, and then also fun to kind of hear what you've done throughout the career. So I appreciate you coming on. To our listeners, as always, thank you for listening to the Helicopter Podcast. Go on social media. It's so easy. Just find us, the Helicopter Podcast, press like, follow, whatever. Uh, Subscribe on Spotify, Apple, do all that stuff. It helps me. Got some exciting things in the works. So we're going to have some upcoming announcements. So stay tuned for that. TJ, again, thank you. And to our listeners, thanks for checking out the Helicopter Podcast. We'll talk to you soon.